Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of July 12th, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm happy to have as our guest on the podcast today, Ross Ramsey. I'm going to call you Executive Editor, Ross, because I can't remember what your interim higher title is.
It's Executive Editor is fine.
Because,
just some guy.
Okay, good. Because he's the same guy. And that same guy was one of the founders of the Texas Tribune and one of the preeminent journalists covering Texas government and politics, not only now, but for a while, that we'll politely put it. And we're very lucky to have Ross on. I wanted to have Ross today to talk about the special session of the Texas legislature, which was called by Governor Abbott a few weeks ago and then went into session on Thursday morning with an 11-item agenda. Near the top of that agenda, if not literally right at the top, I think it was the second agenda, was revisiting the Republican-sponsored and supported election legislation, which has been very controversial and brought a lot of national attention to Texas, given the general discussion of elections and what is seen by Democrats and by many even non-Democratic observers as a nationwide push by Republicans at the state level to add voting restrictions to existing law and modifications to existing law that are seen as likely to limit turnout and to advantage Republicans moving forward. We'll talk about that in more detail, but one of the reasons I'm glad Ross is here is because there's breaking news today. I guess I should just say here, Ross and I did another online panel with a couple of other colleagues about 2 hours ago. In the interim, NBC first reported, I believe, and then the Texas Tribune was right on their heels, that the Democrats are now planning to leave the state in order to break quorum. And by break quorum, of course, we mean by not showing up in the legislature and therefore depriving the legislature of a quorum, which is the working requisite threshold of people present to actually pass laws and to act. So the idea here is, and it's not a new one, as we'll get into, is that if the Democrats leave town and enough of them leave town, there aren't enough members of the body to do business, and they can therefore prevent the legislature from, or the House in this case, from passing any legislation. And earlier this morning, I think we got a little bit of a sketch of this, in that the Senate wound up adjourning early because many Democrats were also absent. Now, wanted to have Ross here to bring us up to date. And again, this is very breaking news, so it's even possible some of this will change by the time we get this recording in the can and put out later today. But Ross and I are going to take a stab at it anyway. So Ross, what's the latest that's being reported by the Tribune and other reporters?
That the Democrats, enough of them, as you said, to deny a quorum, the minimum number of people needed to conduct business, are talking about going to Washington. And the idea is to deny the quorum first, to sort of freeze the Texas legislature, and then to hopefully talk Congress into paying attention to this issue and getting back together on, or at least getting back the effort to limit these voting laws or to control these voting laws from the national level. They're going to lose at the state level. And implicitly in this is the idea that if we lose at the state level, the only thing that might save the Democrats is some kind of national intervention. And so instead of going to Ardmore, Oklahoma, like they did over redistricting 10 years ago, or Albuquerque, New Mexico, they're going to Washington to try to bring this issue to national attention and, more importantly, to congressional attention.
I think you raise an interesting point about this that's worth making, is that there's a two-pronged strategy here, at least theoretically, and just to flesh out your point about national legislation, there are two big bills pending in Congress right now that are sponsored by the Democrats. The first bill is a large omnibus election bill, which I believe is House Bill 1 at the national level, that would not only prevent many of the kinds of changes, or put it this way, preempt many of the kinds of changes being discussed in state law in places like Texas and elsewhere. But that big bill also includes a lot of other provisions that speak to a larger kind of framework of democracy and the way that institutions are functioning. I believe that bill, the last writing I saw, has provisions to create federal law to regulate redistricting and make it more nonpartisan. There's campaign finance laws in there. So there's a lot in that bill that has made it very difficult to pass thus far. And so, I think your point, Ross, that part of what the Democrats are trying to accomplish is to breathe new life into that by drawing attention to what's going on in Texas. And then the other bill is a more limited, but also very far-reaching bill, which would be the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would reestablish and strengthen and to some extent restore some of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act as it was passed in 1965 and then augmented later on by Congress that have in the interim been thrown out by the Supreme Court, including a decision very recently. So both of those bills would help Texas Democrats in their own way. The big omnibus bill would knock out some of the election provisions that Democrats are trying to block in Texas. Failing that, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would reopen some of the means that Democrats have used in the past to fight voting rights. So I'm curious, Ross, had you anticipated the Washington, D.C. move? I mean, one of the things we were talking about this morning was, where would they go and how long could they stay there? How do you think Washington, D.C. plays into that?
Well, I think Washington, D.C., I think the first question is, will they leave the state? And that's kind of what we were kicking around this morning, and where would they go? And the idea there is that the Texas Rangers can't chase them across state lines. So if the Speaker of the House decided he wanted a quorum, he could tell the Texas Rangers, go find everybody, haul them in here. That action is known as putting a call on the House. But if they're out of state, that doesn't work. So that's the first step. The second step is, where do you go? And I know even the last time they did this, where do you go becomes a story. So one of the things they didn't do last time, they were careful not to go to New Orleans or Las Vegas or someplace where it would look like they were just partying. And the reason I mention that is because this time they're going someplace where the second story after they left is, where did they go? And they have a story to tell if they go to Washington. So when you pick the place, you're actually picking the story you want to tell. And in this case, knowing that they're going to lose on this issue because they just don't have the numbers in the House and the Senate. That's not cynical, it's just math. And they know that that's going to happen. So if you can delay this and bring some attention to it, we already have two pieces of evidence that a little sunlight can kill parts of this bill. The bill that was up at the end of the legislative session included a change in the opening time for early voting on Sundays from 11 a.m., I believe, to 1 p.m. And it basically undermined a fairly widespread program, particularly in Black churches, called Souls to the Polls, where basically, you go to the service, you get up from the pew and you jump in a car and you go to the polls and you vote and then you go to lunch. And if you delay that until 1, you've got a break in that schedule and a break in that program. And it was seen as a targeted effort to suppress voting, or one voter turnout tactic that's used pretty widely by Black churches. Once they had called attention to it, the Republicans actually called it a typo. Oh, that wasn't supposed to be in there. There was another one that would allow a judge to undo an election. That one didn't survive daylight either. So one of the advantages of a delay is that you put a spotlight on things that weren't spotlighted before, and maybe by doing so, kill them. The other thing here is that, maybe they will get Congress to jump or to act or turn this into a national conversation. And that too could either, subvert a state bill, or could bring the state people, the state sponsors, the Republicans who are backing this bill, to look at some of the provisions and say, well, let's tone this down a little bit.
Right.
I don't know if it'll actually be successful, but that's the only strategy they've got left to them.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about that, Russ, because I mean that's kind of the way I frame this too. Is that there's a two route strategy here in which you're hoping and probably the preferred the preferred outcome for the Texas Democrats that are planning this would be to help out the national Democrats and juice up the effort to pass one or the other of the national bills. But I'm wondering, the second part that you allude to is that you to some degree open negotiations. And now none of these negotiations I wouldn't think would be public, but in which Democrats are on the phone with Republicans in Texas,
right?
Trying to find an ideal point that Democrats could accept for this bill. I don't know how far that could go. Do you?
Well, this gets into a really interesting piece of politics between the House and the Senate. So at the end of the legislative session, or let's say in the last month of the legislative session, the House passed a voting bill and the Senate passed a voting bill, and the Senate's bill was much stricter and went much further than the House's did. And the question was, how are they going to reconcile these bills when they take it to conference committee? And what happened in conference committee was that it stalled for a while. And then in the final days of the session, the conference committee handed up a bill that not only was stronger than the Senate version, it included 21 more pages of restrictions. And it went to the floor of the Senate late. It passed the Senate somewhere between 2 and 6 o'clock in the morning, I forget, on the last, I guess, Sunday morning of the session. It went over to the House in a hurry. The House, ran it as quickly as they could, but they got to the end of the legislative day, and the Democrats looked up at the clock and said, hey, if we just ditch this place for a couple of hours, we'll kill this legislation. So you already have a situation where the House has passed a milder version of the voting rights bill that the Democrats didn't like, but they could hold their noses and go home, semi-happy with. The Senate passed one that they just flat didn't like. And the question in this special session is, which version will prevail? Does the governor care if it's the strict version or the mild version? Does the House care to pass the bill or vote on the bill that the Senate had? Or can you talk the Senate off the cliff? So if you get the Democrats and you get some outside pressure in that situation, I think there's some room for movement that we saw in May in the legislature, even in this special session.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, that sounds pretty good, but I also don't wonder if now people are, and by people, I mean, really the House Democrats, are now more committed in a way that makes it harder for them to compromise again in a way that they did. I mean, even if the Senate was to say, and we can go down this, too far, but
right.
Even if the will of the Senate was fine, we'll go back to that, to that something approximating that version of the bill. I'm not entirely sure that the Democrats are now in a position to take that deal.
Right. That's the question. And what do you do with the Senate Democrats? What are they doing right now? They're looking like, they've got to be feeling like there's a whole book here, but they've got to be feeling like, the House Democrats are taking a position that they were at least publicly not taking. The Senate's a peculiar institution right now. Without trying to sound like a geezer, I mean, there was a time not very long ago when you sort of had to know what the senators thought about a particular issue to figure out where the Texas Senate was going. And now you really just need to know where the lieutenant governor wants it to go, because the Senate, follows him with a faithfulness that, previous lieutenant governors only dreamed of. And
yeah, I mean, it's a big factor that the Texas Senate now is functioning in a way that it is not, I don't want to say normal, but it's not historically familiar for the lieutenant governor to have so much influence and for the Senate to be so, I'm just going to use the word, even though it's a little unfair, but for the Senate as a body to be so subservient to the lieutenant governor.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the question really, the play here is in the House. And the question is, the Speaker has a couple of concerns here. One of them is that he's a Republican, and one of them is that he's a Speaker. And the difference there is, the Republicans want this legislation. I have no question that, Dade Phelan wants this legislation on some level as a Republican. But there's also a question of, representing the House. And, you represent the House in particular. This has always been a function of the Texas House. There's the House that you see and the House that you don't see. And the House that you see is the one where this group over here says we want yes vote on a piece of legislation, and this group over here says we want to know, and they're really demonstrative, and they stand up and they give press conferences and all that. The other Senate is the private Senate, and that's the line, or the House rather, and that's the one where there's a line of representatives outside the Speaker's office going in there and telling him, look, if this comes to the floor, I'm going to vote for it because everybody's going to be watching. But I don't want this to come to the floor because I don't want to vote for it. This is what happened 4 years ago with what was called the bathroom bill, an attempt to regulate, transgender people's use of public facilities. And, it was one of those things where the speaker at the time, Joe Strauss, his members were telling him they didn't want to vote on it. And so he took all of the flack for them and didn't bring it to the floor, so they didn't have to vote. The question I have on this voting bill is how many Republicans really want the bill the Senate passed, and how many Republicans in the House really want the House passed. And I think if there's any maneuvering room, it's to tell the Democrats, if in fact this is the case, that the House Republicans will vote for their more diluted version of this bill if the Democrats will come back. And if the Democrats don't come back, they're just going to wait them out and pass the Senate version.
And there does seem to be some, a lot of indication. And, we had Representative Clardy on the podcast a few weeks ago that there were clear signals coming from some corners. And you talked about the different factions in the Republican caucus in each chamber. And I think that's related here. But nonetheless, Representative Clardy was making it pretty clear that there was a lot of room for compromise among Republicans, that they were going to pass a bill, but that, some of the more egregious things that you were talking about could be left out of the bill, and that Republicans wouldn't really mind that very much. There were a lot of Republicans in the House that wouldn't mind that very much. So I think that's right.
Right.
Stepping back a second. So, when we were talking about this a few hours ago, as I said at the outset, there are 11 items on the special agenda, and one of them is very structurally and institutionally important. And that's the item that the governor put on the special call that says that says that the legislature needed to revisit funding for the legislature in the next biennium that starts September 1st. Now, the governor put that on the call because he vetoed the funding for the legislature amidst much controversy and creating a lot of hostility, I think, for a while between the legislature and the governor. But that's at work here, too, that if the Democrats break quorum, as it looks like they're going to, and they leave and the House cannot act, one of the things they can't act on is funding for the legislative branch for the next 2 years, starting September 1st. Now, that's not the legislators themselves, but their salary is fairly marginal because they only make $7,200 a year. But this is all the staff and the administrative support system that the legislature needs to do, among other things, redistricting next year. So, how does that play into the tactics here?
Well, the governor did this kind of in a fit of pique. It was his action after the Democrats walked out on the voting bill at the end of the session. He vetoed the legislative funding in the budget, signed the rest of the budget, and said, I'm going to call you back, and, basically said, pass my bill or you won't be funded. Pretty straight up parliamentary face-off there. And the problem is that, most of the funding for staff, is for Republican staff. So, people like Dade Phelan weren't happy about it. The governor is, messing around with that institutional pride of the House versus the executive, or the House versus the Senate, or the House and Senate versus the executive. And, was telling them basically, do this or else. And the or else isn't good for anybody. It's not good for the Democrats in the House. It's not good for the Republicans in the House. It's not good for the Republicans in the executive branch. They need that staff back next fall to be drawing political maps, for example, and to do all of the things that make that part of the government work. As you get closer and closer to the September 1st deadline, I think the leverage the Democrats have begins to rise, where the governor has to come to their side and basically say, okay, sign the budget. And then we'll try to pick up the rest of the pieces here. Right now, the governor is saying, they're threatening the budget. There's another item on the agenda that's what they call a 13th check for teachers. They get monthly retirement checks, and a 13th check, when there's enough money in the fund, sometimes they write them an extra check. And that's a big Democratic constituency. And so I think part of the thinking there is that the Democrats will want to be here for that. Right now, the Democrats are in a position where they're saying, look, the House and the Senate are running these voting bills through very quickly. Both of them had their first hearing on these. The special session started on Thursday. They had, almost all night hearings on these on the weekend. They're supposed to vote on them, I think, this week in both places. And the Democrats are saying, slow your roll there. We're going to go to Washington. We're going to make this an issue. We're going to talk about this. And if you want to, make us any offers about, what you'll do if we come back, we're all ears.
And in the meantime, the functioning of one branch of government is in question. I mean, one of the really interesting things about that was that it really does really highlights that, separation of powers and checks and balances are real things that, we're so used to watching in recent times because of hyper-partisanship and how different and hostile the parties have become to each other. We're used to watching most of the battles being Democrats versus Republicans. And as you kind of implied, and I'm just trying to draw it out a little bit, that the governor, in vetoing the legislative article that in the budget really drew, just invited a conflict between the executive and the legislative branch.
Right.
And, so we're seeing this, this emerging kind of friction and this fluctuation between, on one hand, as we were discussing earlier this morning, as you mentioned, Speaker Dave Phelan probably very unhappy about, having to hear from his majority caucus that they're not going to be able to pay their staffers and that their staffers are understandably worried about their livelihoods.
Or his own
because of
staffers.
this. And his own staffers, and that this has been done by a Republican governor. And so the fact that that's brewing beneath this highly partisan conflict between Democrats and Republicans over voting adds, as you kind of implied, in some ways, a very unnecessary level of conflict here. I think when the governor did, threaten to defund the legislature and to veto that article, I mean, I was skeptical he would carry it out, honestly, because I thought cooler heads would prevail. And that's really just not been the case.
There were no cooler heads. It doesn't really help in these arguments when you're fighting over something to introduce a second thing to fight about. You've got a distraction now. You're fighting over this voting law, and you can argue your side, and you can argue provision by provision, or you can argue the omnibus versus the omnibus, but it's a fight about voting. It's largely loaded as a partisan issue, and to a great extent comes out of, in particular, Republican questions about the veracity of the election result in 2020 and the issues that former President Trump has raised and all of that stuff. So you've got this sort of giant partisan boil that is a lot. I mean, it's a big fight and there's no reason to add to it. And then the governor adds this other institutional fight and it blurs the loyalties. What were fairly clear partisan lines in the other fight are now blurred, as you said, between not just parties, but also the executive versus the legislative. And some of the legislators on the governor's side who agree with the governor on the bill and on the legislation are ticked off about this legislative thing and ticked off about the use of this particular veto as a tool in the governor's box.
Yeah, I mean, I think that frustration it's been in public, it's been muted, but only compared to, normally. I mean, I think you're still having some Republicans. I think it's been expressed by Republicans as a kind of Republican legislators as a kind of bewilderment rather than an open anger at the government.
Right.
Kind of a, shucks, I don't really know why he did that. And then, you get off the record and people start cussing.
That's exactly right.
I don't know if you've had that experience.
Yeah, I've had that same conversation. I wonder if we were talking to the same people. That's funny.
So the modulation of those two things, I think the other thing that, is interesting to go back to a beat just for a point you made earlier is that, there is something about the Democratic strategy, the Texas Democrats strategy here that is very risky in the sense that, and I can see where they may think this is the only play they have and it's done now. So second guessing it, could wait for later. But it does seem to me that if the idea is, we can help push the voting legislation that's been stalled at the national level, we can re-energize this at the national level, that may really be underestimating just how complicated and problematic things are for congressional Democrats and frankly for the Biden agenda right now, because there's a lot at play here.
Yeah, there's a ton of crossfire, and there are almost certainly people in Washington who, for various reasons, agree with the Democrats on this and that and the other thing, but are interested in another fight, who just feel like this is something else that's going to be a distraction for whatever it is they were trying to get done.
Right. I mean, you've got the infrastructure bill at play, which
Right.
is obviously the Biden administration, certainly their number one priority right now. You've got that's been broken up into the fiscal infrastructure and kind of the social human infrastructure spending that was originally all part of the same strategy. That's now been de facto broken up. You've got a budget resolution pending. There is a lot going on. And I think you're right. I like the way you put that, in that, there are going to be Democrats in Washington who will have to greet the Texas Democrats as heroes for political reasons, but I'll bet there's a lot of grumbling behind the scenes.
In some ways, it's the same strategy happening in Washington that's happening in Texas. If you have a fight and it's about one thing, there's a big advantage if you're trying to press a fight like that. And that's one of the strengths of a governor calling a special session, is that if you call a special session on one issue and that's the only thing anybody's talking about, then your idea and your proposal are front and center. And the minute you begin introducing other things like vetoing the legislature's budget or something like that, you begin to dilute the forces and your fight's not as clean.
Yeah.
And Washington is that on steroids. They've got 17 different fights going, as you say. And here comes Texas with another distraction. And they may be sympathetic to the distraction, but they're probably some version of, hey, can't you tell we're trying to do something else here?
Yeah, agenda control and agenda management are really central legislative tools. And the special session gives the governor is one of those moments where the governor's influence increases because he has so much influence over management of the agenda.
Right.
I think you're right that it does take us back to the fact of the veto of the legislative article and how that seems to have been diluted what should have been a pretty clear advantage for Republicans. So in our last couple of minutes, Ross, I'm going to ask you something really unfair, which is, given all this and given that you've had all of 2 hours to think about it since it happened, along with all the other things. So, you think the Democrats will come back before the session is over, or is this going to last the rest of the special session? And then, we're going to be at a crisis point in late August.
I'm not really thinking about it as when the session is over. I'm thinking about it when the summer is over. And the reason is, as you pointed out, the current budget goes through the end of August. The new budget starts on September 1st. And the real question hanging here is, will the legislature's budget be in place in time for September 1st? So whether it's in this special session or this one bombs and the governor calls them right back, the real date here is going to be the end of August. And I don't think that the Democrats are likely to hold out in Washington or someplace else outside of the state for that period of time. I think you probably come to a head in some way or another. You either get some federal movement on some federal legislation, you get some kind of conversation going on state legislation, the House bill versus the Senate bill or whatever form that takes. Or you get this brinksmanship that the governor set up. And if this is the one biggest risk that faces Abbott here. He's sitting pretty in a lot of ways, but if you deliver an ultimatum, it only works if the other side folds. And if the Democrats don't fold here and you can't get that legislative funding back in place, everybody in at least for near-term history is going to be talking about that. He's that governor that vetoed the legislature.
Yeah, there's a part of this that's just an old-fashioned game of chicken.
Right.
I think that's right. And so you've got the governor needing to get something out of this, and the Democrats facing, not wanting to back down, but facing very difficult conditions. And I think we were talking about this earlier. I think one thing to remember, from the perspective of the Democrats being in Washington, this is a, collection of, more than 50, human beings that are going to have to leave home and then stay out of the state for as long as it takes. And that creates collective action problems. You got to keep everybody on board, and, nobody can defect. And, as soon as somebody says, oh, I'm tired of this, I can't do this anymore, I got to come home, it poses a big problem.
And they picked an expensive place to go.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to make it from July 12th to August 30th, Ardmore, Oklahoma is probably the hotel rates are better.
Yeah. And the Democrats, look, some of them individually are fine. But as a party and as an entity, there are not infinite resources to pay for this, and that will become an issue. And it'll be, there will be news stories. I'm sure you guys are working on it. I'm sure reporters all over the state, if not the country, are going, okay, so how are they going to pay for this? Where are they staying? What's it costing? Where's the money coming from?
Well, I think the money piece, there is an interesting thing here. This is like so many things in politics right now. It's a fundraising opportunity. Send money, keep the Democrats in Washington, keep Texas from, you could probably, I haven't looked, we probably both all have all of those emails piling in both from Republicans and Democrats. So that part's interesting. It is expensive both in the financial sense, though, to do the Washington thing. And as you point out, in the personal sense, I'm away from the kids, the family, my work that pays me a salary.
Yeah.
All of that stuff's a real boiler.
On that happy note, but it's a practical note, reminding people that legislators are real people as well, which, in these fights can sometimes get lost. Ross, thanks for being here. Much appreciate the time on what I know is a very busy day.
Always a pleasure. Thanks.
And thanks to our crew in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks to you for listening. And a programming note, I will be out of town next week, and so we won't have a podcast next week. But then we'll come back and see how much things have changed or how much they've not changed a week after that. So take care all, and we'll talk to you soon. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.